Okay, so we're just going to move on to the first panel now because unfortunately Alexei Reznikov cannot join us this morning. He called, his schedule has changed. So we hope that we can get him up at another time, but unfortunately he can't speak to us now. So our first panel is Ukraine under attack, how the war in Ukraine has unfolded, what this will mean for the Ukrainian nation going forward and its sense of identity, and can we begin to look towards a post-war future, or is it too soon? And speaking to us about this is Hlib Vyshlinsky, Liliana Filipchuk, Mariia Zolkina, Mykhailo Samus, and Iskra Kirova. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Belgrade Center for Security Policy for this invitation. It's a real humbling experience to be here and to have the opportunity to moderate this very important discussion that I think will also set the scene for a lot of what we'll discuss over the next 2 days. I'd like to dive right into our panel. We've already heard a lot, and maybe just to take a closer look at where things stand now on the ground and with recent political developments. Over the last 2 months, the war has entered in a new phase with the announced so-called partial mobilization in Russia, which then proceeded to annex through sham referenda territories under its occupation, particularly the regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. This then was followed by horrific airstrikes on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and cities, wreaking much havoc. And we have also, in the last months, heard Putin's yet most explicit nuclear threats. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to Mariia Zolkina and ask you, Mariia, how is this escalation perceived from Ukraine, and what does it tell us about the course of the war right now?
Thank you, Iskra. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for organization of this very important both conference on the one hand and panel on the other hand. So speaking from what is going on the ground, I would say that what world has really to understand about Ukraine is that Ukrainians are very united in terms of their belief that Ukraine will win this war, and public opinion polls which we succeed to conduct even in the times of ongoing aggression against Ukraine prove that. 90% of Ukrainians right now believing that Ukraine will win this war and believe that Ukraine should not concede or surrender any inch of its territory. At the same time, it explains why we have all these, let's say, attempts to repel Russia's attacks in Donbas, and we are succeeding in that. So basically right now, the front line is still not stable, but we understand what is going on where. We need to understand that Russia has fully failed with its even one of the modest Russian goals to capture Donbas. They don't have any prospects to capture Donetsk region, and they have stuck completely along the front line, which they reached at the beginning of the summer. Moreover, Ukraine has returned the control over a very important Kharkiv region, started liberating the Luhansk region, which is my native region, for instance. And at the same time, we are conducting a bit slower, but still counteroffensive in Kherson region. It's different from the rapid, efficient counterattack which Ukraine demonstrated to the whole world when it came to the Kharkiv region recently. But in Kherson, it's still very well-planned and sophisticated operation, moving even with, let's say, smaller steps, but moving forward. So when it comes to the price of the victory, it means that for Ukrainian side, we understand that the price will be high in terms of destruction, in terms of life of our people, but we don't see any other way to win this war, because the elimination of Ukrainian state, elimination of Ukrainian nation, we perceive it as a genocidal war against Ukraine. And even the severe attacks on critical infrastructure, I mean energy and power plants of all over Ukraine, we perceived it as the attempt to make Ukrainian people freeze, to make Ukrainian people be deprived of basic needs, because not just schools or buildings will be without electricity in case these attacks are continued, but people in hospitals will be not served in a proper way, let's say. So we are considering it as a genocide, and both on practical and legal level, Ukraine has started already processing this issue. I mean, Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Justice are pushing this issue for international negotiations and for international institutions in order to make Russia be responsible for that. I mean, for establishing of international tribunals. When it comes to the basic interest of the sides, let's say, when for us, it's not just to liberate our territory, but to make Russia not be able to attack Ukraine in 1 year, in half of the year, of formal or not formal end of this very war. So it's very important to make Russia be not simply capable of another aggression. And that's why the ideas of so-called temporary or formal ceasefire, which are being more and more pushed by Russia since the mid of summer, and maybe we will talk about that later. Yes, we perceive it just as a threat to Ukraine. And I can elaborate later, but basically what we see now, consolidation of Ukrainian society, support to authorities and to the army. This, I would say, this is maybe the first moment in Ukrainian history when there is a full consensus between NGOs, between society, wide public generally, and authorities about how Ukrainian policy should look like. It's about repelling Russian attack and liberating Ukrainian territories, including Crimea and previously occupied part of the Donbas.
Thank you, Mariia, and we'll get also into more detail later on, both on the negotiations and Ukrainian attitudes. I want to turn to Mykhailo now and just ask more specifically about Ukraine's military resilience at the moment. So Ukraine has coped well with positional war, has made some successes with counteroffensive, particularly in the east, not so much in the south, but it is more vulnerable in terms of air defense. And then there's winter coming as far as the ground war is concerned and all the challenges that Ukraine and the Ukrainian army will face. How do you assess Ukraine's military resilience at this moment?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. And traditionally, I'd like to thank to Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting just now on the battlefield, to men and women who are actually protecting us. And we can be here on this beautiful city when Russian aggressors attacking Ukrainian territory. Talking about the military picture, I would say that I think Mariia described the situation, and actually your question had an answer. Why Russia started to make these nuclear fake operations, like dirty bombs? Why Russia started to this annexation? Why Russia started this so-called mobilization? Because they totally lost on battlefield. In reality, Ukrainian armed forces already defeated professional Russian army. They doesn't exist now. So now they started to recruit criminals. They started to recruit by mobilization normal people. It's not the soldiers. They are just normal people who believed Putin somehow. Or maybe they don't believe Putin, but living in this dictatorship, they need to go to die because of Putin ideas. And this is the reality of this war on current moment, that even we're talking about winter, for Putin in reality, now the main task here and a goal on the battlefield, to stop Ukrainian armed forces, which is continuing the offensive operation on south and east, and do not allow Ukrainians to deliberate new lands, to freeze this situation till the spring, because these genocide missile strikes, you remember a couple of weeks ago, they started to make hundreds of missile strikes, especially to civilian infrastructure. No military, I underline, no military objects. Only energy, only electricity, only the heating facilities in Ukrainian cities to organize, I call it Holodomor. We had a Golodomor, but now they're trying to organize another genocide, Holodomor. Like, I think in Serb language, Holod, Hlad, it's the same like in Ukrainian. So it's to freeze Ukrainian people, they started to protest against Zelensky because one of the main myths of Russian propaganda that Zelensky is extremist, Nazist, but Ukrainian people just under the influence of this Nazist ideology. But Mariia told 90% of Ukrainians, they are not a zombie. They just want to be free. They just want to live in normal country, in democratic world, in normal economy, to make business, to live in comfortable conditions, and have a self-development for their children in normal, civilized, not like in Russia. We understood, I heard the Prize Nobel laureate, she told that we didn't recognize that Putin is so dangerous for Russia. We recognize this very, very easy. When Yanukovych arrived to the office, we recognized this is Putin. Putin methods, Putin technologies. And that's why we push out Yanukovych, do not allow them to build Russia in Ukraine. It was 2013, 2014. And that's why Putin decided to start the war in 2014. In 2024, it was a new escalation. So talking about the battlefield, I think the main forecast, Putin will try to freeze the situation because he thinks that time playing for him, because we'll try to organize this crazy bad winter for Ukraine and Europe, of course. He's dreaming about the energy crisis in Europe, and that's why he's trying to stop Ukrainian offensive operations. But I think he will get opposite, because when after this massive missile and Iranian drone strikes against civilian infrastructure, we have even more intentions to go forward and to liberate our land.
Thank you, Mykhailo, for this picture of Ukraine's determination. Very important to start from that. And I want to still look at what's happening on the ground and in the east, and turn to Liliana. So these annexed territories, to control them, Russia will need to have people there on its side. Is that working right now? Of course, here's where the question of deportation and forced displacement comes in. Can you give us an assessment of these tactics and how effective are they?
Yeah, for what I can say for sure is that these tactics were in force long centuries ago. I mean that Russian Empire and then the USSR have been using these tactics for a longer period of times by deporting people and by using force in order to create the more the society who would actually be able to believe in the propaganda what was spread on that times. But I would say now it's more like a black box in terms of the numbers of people who've been deported and in terms of the conditions of the process. We know only some data which is coming from Russian Federation itself, and we don't know if there is a possibility to trust in this data. Also, Ukrainian civil society organizations are in danger in occupied territories, and by the occupied territories I mean the territories of Crimea and Donbass and newly occupied territories as well. There have been some casualties already among the civil society activists, and they are in danger, like it's a priority for the occupiers to captivate these people and to make them not capable of any of anything. Also, I would like to say that now Ukrainian society has been showing so much resilience over what have been happening, and for now it's interesting to see that local governments and so municipalities and grassroots organizations are actually taking care and assisting a lot of IDPs, internally displaced people, and people affected by the war. It's pretty obvious now that in the beginning of full-scale invasion, it was very supported by the general public, and a lot of people were engaged into helping the IDPs, assisting them in the hosting communities. But now, when it is prolonged, protracted conflict, and when it's enduring, now some initiatives are growing and expanding. They are actually now more like projects that can show some durable solutions. When we talk, for example, in terms of providing housing, and when we talk about the providing employment opportunities. It's I can bring like many examples from every region of Ukraine. Now, I am based in Ivano-Frankivsk region, and it showed that the local government is very much interested in helping businesses to move to this region and to employ the people who come in. Also, the idea of the internally displaced person in Ukraine has changed already, because in the previous phase of people influx, when it was 2014, 2015, the IDPs were seen as vulnerable people who cannot help themselves and who just demand something. It was a general idea, and sometimes in some regions there were I would not say conflicts, but like possibilities of conflicts. Now, in this stage, it has changed totally, and the idea of the person who is forced to move to another part of Ukraine or is forced to move to neighboring countries is changing greatly. And it is again has to do more with Ukrainian resilience and with our trust in ourselves.
So you are painting a very positive picture of the resilience of Ukrainian society and dealing with the IDP issue. But we also know that a lot of people might be displaced this winter. The World Health Organization has come out with some figures, 2 to 3 million people might be displaced. And of course, many might just have to leave their homes simply because of lack of heating. So there are quite some urgent needs. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree that the needs are really critical, and I maybe forgot to mention that now civil society organizations are dealing with that in cooperation with local governments, and it's like the leadership, what is going on, and the central government is more of consulting, supporting, providing general framework for the process, but the local governments are now capable of doing more for the assistance of IDPs. And it's also important to mention that this is possible. I mean, the resilience is possible, of course, thanks to the international organizations and donors who've been helping Ukraine to overcome some problems with resources. And yes.
Thank you. We'll come to that question of how Ukraine's Western partners are supporting it right now. But I also would like to bring in our colleague Hlib, who is joining us online, and to continue talking actually about the resilience of the Ukrainian state after all the economic and other damage it has suffered. So just in the 2 weeks since the 10th of October, when airstrikes intensified, we've seen some data that over 400 infrastructure facilities have been severely damaged in about 16 regions of Ukraine. About 1/3 of Ukraine's power supply has been severely affected. Can you give us a picture of the impact of all the damage and destruction that Ukraine has suffered? And also, as a second follow-up question, how do you see Ukraine being able to cope in the next months, and again, particularly with the onset of winter?
Yeah, thank you. What we see now is that these attacks resulted in a decline in electricity consumption of approximately 10%. And generally in the worst scenario, it could significantly increase the decline in Ukrainian economy this year, like while currently general expectations are that Ukrainian economy will decrease by 30 to 35% this year, like with central estimate of like 32, 33. Then like the worst scenario is additional 5 to 6% percentage points of GDP decline this year, and next year turning from expected growth to even possibly double-digit additional decline of the Ukrainian economy. Like besides direct and like very clear short-term economic consequences, certainly like there are longer-term consequences and longer-term risks. The biggest risk is certainly migration. We saw before this Russian terrorist attacks, small but significant inflow of Ukrainian refugees from abroad back to Ukraine. Now, like we see that in small amounts, but like the flow changed direction. And if disruptions become even more severe, then it could result in the second wave of refugees like coming to the European Union and other neighboring countries. It will have not only impact on those exception countries, but certainly on the Ukrainian economy, as it will have additional impact on consumption, negative impact of consumption on production as well. So like what help Ukraine will need now to withstand this terrorist pressure is like firstly like help, especially in kind with needed equipment, especially transformers for the power grid, as Russia deliberately targeted transformers in in these attacks, then it could be a financial help for buying like natural gas, additional natural gas. It could increase production on those surviving thermal power plants and increasing the supply to the power network of Ukraine. And then in the worst scenario, it could be an import of electricity from the EU, while just months ago Ukraine was able to export electricity. And certainly like air defense as like the best insurance against further destruction is needed as soon as possible, and certainly like our partners understand this need, and it is crucial. And certainly like budget assistance is needed to withstand this additional pressure on economy and losses and decrease in well-being affecting Ukrainian citizens.
Thank you, Hlib. And we'll come back to that in terms of what specifically Ukraine needs to get from the West. But I want to zoom out now a bit from the events on the ground and talk a little bit more about some of the political questions, so to speak, and starting with the perceptions of this war, which I think is also a very important question to discuss here in Belgrade today. One of sort of the centerpiece of Russia's narrative engineering has been to frame this war as a standoff between Russia and NATO, whereby Ukraine is only the collateral damage, and it's really because NATO has failed to meet Russia's legitimate interest that this war has come about. And this narrative has had some success, including here in Serbia, as we heard earlier. Mariia, I'd like to turn to you. How do you address some of these fundamental misperceptions about the war and its underpinnings?
I think it's very important because Russia doesn't actually create nothing new for any of the regions. It just manipulates with the same messages, just covering it a little bit differently when it comes to North Africa, to the Middle East, or to Western Europe. Because the main Russian narrative is that Russia is fighting not Ukraine but NATO, didn't appear just from the very beginning of the war. So let's remember that in February and even in March, Russia actually pushed the narrative that this is denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine and elimination of so-called Nazi government of Ukraine. And only when failed with this blitzkrieg against Ukrainian army and Ukrainian society, because we perceive it as like the war of Ukrainian people against aggressor, against imperialistic Russia's attempts to colonize Ukraine one more time. So it's not just about army fighting. When Russia failed, they sent another message that no, they couldn't fail to Ukraine. They couldn't be defeated by a regular army of Ukraine, which was underestimated both by Russia and our Western partners. That's why they created this narrative and put it on the first place that they are fighting NATO or they are fighting the whole West. Because when you are fighting the whole West and cannot win even Donbass, that's not such an embarrassing for Russian imperialistic, let's say, image. And that's why they push this message, and at the same time they're just playing with anti-American sentiments all over the world. I spent a couple of months in Qatar. What I found there, just Russian experts working for decades in the region, they sent the same message as in Western Europe, but just using the Iraq case. In Balkans, they use their own specific let's say, NATO or the problems with American sentiments. In Germany, they also use the anti-American instruments, sending their experts saying publicly that America is like the leader of NATO, but you have to, to lead this organization equally because everyone should be equal. So basically, this is an attempt of Russia to justify what they are actually doing in Ukraine. Second important message, that Russia tries to justify, but someone else aggressive policy, mistakes, participation in some kind of wars or military interventions. They use that experience to justify their aggressive war against Ukraine. And what they're saying basically is, if someone else did something bad, I'm just hyperbolizing right now, in that or that country, why are we not allowed to do something bad towards Ukraine? But Ukraine is fighting for its territory, which is our sovereign territory, for its independence, and for international law. So it means that defending Ukrainian territorial integrity, any country around the world, just signifies they are in favor of the principle of territorial integrity, like it's stated, and it should be defended. It should be put just from theory of United Nations Charter into the practical area of public policy. And third important message when it comes to Russia narrative on international arena, Russia tries to show that Ukraine is completely in this war. It's not just a collateral damage coming to Ukraine, but it's about Ukraine being not able to make independent decisions like a puppet government of the West or so on. But if you will go a little bit deeper into the local context, you will understand that empire never recognize, until there are domestic changes within the country with imperialistic sentiments, they will never recognize the former part of this empire as something able and capable of independent decisions. And that's what we are fighting for. As I like to repeat, under certain circumstances, you can make people make political decisions. You can make politicians start some kind of negotiations or whatever, but you can never force the people and even the army to fight and fight effectively. And even the military experts, Mykhailo can say about this much better than I do, they now, I think, reassess the importance of motivations when it comes to the capabilities of the army to resist. Because what we are seeing on the ground, basically, that Ukrainian motivations of the same ordinary people who were mobilized voluntarily in the spring, and as a result of their own decision, they came to military conscription offices, and they were mobilized. Their motivation rules and drives their successes on the ground, while people mobilized in Russia doesn't understand what they're doing. And if I may, just 1 minute about some very important data regarding occupied
Mariia,
territories.
we'll come to that data, but let me also bring in Mykhailo on this. And again, it's this question, and Mariia explained that very well. So Russia's very effectively used anti-Western sentiment. It has exploited grievances from the recent past. And there is a lot to be said about these grievances, and we do not condone any of that, but it has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. But it has been successfully used to gain support for that war. So how does Ukraine make its case to those countries that have not yet condemned Russia's aggression and that are still sitting on the fence? Because their support will be very critical also at the global level, at the UN level, to drive any Ukrainian initiatives forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I support Mariia, everything that talking about NATO, it's absolutely fake. It's an anti-Americanism, and especially here, for example, in Serbia, using the pattern like, okay, Russia is fighting with NATO is very easily here to explain people that why actually they shouldn't support Ukraine and why they should be, let's say, neutral in this war. It's very easy. If they fighting with NATO, we remember in 1999, so it's very easy to understand for Serbian people why they should be outside of this war, because two Slavic nations fighting each other, okay. But in the same time, I would say that no NATO in this case, absolutely no NATO. And Russian leadership, and especially Putin, absolutely understand it, never will fight with NATO, never will fight with NATO. Even now, if you look at the map, and you see the military units of Russia, they put out all of military units from Finland border. Even Finland now is becoming a NATO member. So if they are afraid of NATO, if they are preparing for a war with NATO, they should send more troops to Finland border. But at the same time, they put it out and then send it to Ukrainian front. And actually, everything in this war about the imperialistic complex of Putin and people like Dugin. I strongly advise you read Dugin books, every explanation here. In all of Dugin Geopolitics, explanation of Ukrainian question, they call it like this. How to solve Ukrainian question, only one or couple sentences in big book, just solve Ukrainian question. This is answer.
Yeah.
That's all.
Thank you.
Solve Ukrainian question means they don't recognize Ukrainian as a nation, the separate nation. They talking about that Ukrainians are only Russians, but with zombie propaganda in the head. So denazification means to kill Ukrainians, which is not trying to be proper Russians. This is clear fascism and Nazism, but this fascism, Nazism proclaim that they are fighting with Nazism. Yeah. This is explanation. And one word about the perceiving and how to understand this war. We are fighting for values. Values, again, to be free, to live in country which we want to build. And we explained it for Putin several times. In 2004-5, the first revolution. Second, 2014, when the revolution on dignity, and of course, 2014, the start of the war. This is a question of values. This is a question of revenge of Putin. He told that the collapse of Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and he understood that he is a messiah with mission to solve this problem, to build a Soviet Union or Soviet Empire 2.0 again. And Ukrainian understanding of this war, we won't give you a chance to do it.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think this is very important to underline this point, this imperialist nature of the war, and not a great power game, as it is often seen. Mariia, let's talk now about the perceptions of Ukrainians of the war. I mean, you've already painted, I think, a picture with what you've said previously of a very determined nation, right? Ukrainians want to win the war. They want to regain all of the illegally occupied territories, as you mentioned. Just give us a bit, in 1 minute, a bit of insight into exactly where popular attitudes are on the war and the end of the war.
Ukrainians were not ready to compromise about Ukrainian territory even before February 24th. I have been dealing with Russian-Ukraine conflict since 2014, basically because I'm originally from the frontline areas in Luhansk region, so I have the emotional and personal motivation to start researching it as an expert. And during all these 8 years of war, when it came to assessing the compromises, whether Ukrainians were ready to sacrifice Crimea or 30% of the Donbas at that time in order to, let's say, solve the conflict with Russia? The answer was no, in different forms, but no. So no autonomy, no special status, no recognition of annexation of Crimea. That was with which kind of sentiments we entered this stage of large-scale invasion. And after February 24th, things became even less, people became even less ready to any kind of compromises about Ukrainian territory. That's very important. So now, the victory of Ukraine, so 72% are strongly believing that the victory of Ukraine should look like complete withdrawal of Russian forces from the entire Ukrainian territory. So it's very important to understand when someone tries to offer Ukrainians to sell out part of its territories, this decision under no circumstances can be legitimized by Ukrainian society. And you can never make a deal without understanding how this decision will be legitimized or not legitimized by the people on the ground. Moreover, 20% out of the 72, they state that besides of full withdrawal of Russian forces from the entire Ukrainian territory, Russian army generally has to be distracted, or some kind of destructive and disintegration processes within the Russian Federation itself should start in order that we will be able to say that this is the victory of Ukraine. That's very important. But withdrawal of Russian forces is like 100% priority number one. Crimea is not discussed. Donbas is not discussed. Before February 24, Ukrainians at least got used to coexist with partially occupied Donbas and Crimea. But after February 24, we understand that Crimea will always be a military base, because what Russia did, just militarized Crimea and made it a huge military basis on the border with continental part of Ukraine. So without liberation of Crimea, there will be no the end of this war. Another important point which makes me proud of, let's say, our research, which we conduct even in the times of the war, is that we find out that there is no, referring to the title of this conference, there is no request or demand for authoritarian tendencies or for the regime of the strong hand in Ukraine, even in the times of a large-scale invasion. What we see in August this year in face-to-face public opinion poll, nationwide and representative one in Ukraine, that the 65% of the people saying that choosing between strong hand regime like authoritarian regime and democracy, they are strongly supporting democracy. And the request for this kind of model of governing increased since last year, which was more calm, let's say. So people understand the value of democratic procedures, even if someone might think that in the times of the war, people were tending for rapid decisions without specific procedures, without democracy, and so on. And the last but not the least point is that when we asked people, again at the end of August this year, what social feelings do they have when they think about the future of Ukraine, 65% say that they have hope in a better future, 40% saying that they have optimism about Ukrainian future. And on the third place comes the anxiety about Ukrainian future with 30%. And when I compared this data with the last year data, I found out that the share of people having hope and optimism about Ukrainian future has risen by 10 up to 20% since last year. So it's about resilience, it's about belief in our own capabilities, and that's what drives Ukrainian to keep on fighting and push our Western partners to support Ukraine up to the full liberation of Ukrainian territory.
Right. Okay, some very high expectations and a lot of optimism. Now, Liliana, you have also done research into this with your organization, and let's just move a little bit further ahead, looking into the outlook of for peace, which it is hard to imagine right now. But how do Ukrainians envision peace, and under what conditions right now?
Yeah, I can very much agree with what Mariia already have put, that for now, Ukrainians don't see any possibility of peaceful negotiations under these circumstances, but we all understand that all wars are ending, and this war should end as well. Ukrainians now are, from what we understood in doing our research on thoughts and feelings of Ukrainians during the war, it is not representative research. This is a research when we asked people open-ended questions, and so we have some insights of how Ukrainians see the future of Ukraine after the war, and how we see the relations with Russia, and what is possible in the future. So from what we understood is that it's not only about the full military defeat of Russia in this war anymore. It's important that we will set up new era of relations with Russia and Russian society. It's interesting that when we asked people the question, what is the most important thing for you to be in the future of Ukraine, So people responded many different actually thoughts, and many people see that Ukraine should be a stronger democracy, that Ukraine should be stronger military as well. But what was surprisingly for me, what I was surprised with is that Ukrainians actually they are afraid to turn into what is happening in Russia or Belarus. So like they are afraid of turning to the point where the society is more radicalized, or turning to the point where all of the people cannot control what the government does. And so this a great demand for the reforms and democratic reforms are still present in the Ukrainian society, even during the war. And so I would like to answer this question about the prospects for reconciliation with Russia, is that reconciliation would be possible only if Russian society will change. And this is very important that Ukrainians see the difference between these societies, because it was not always the case. We were always looking at what is happening in Moscow and what are they are doing. Now it's pretty much obvious that Ukrainians will need Russian society to be open, tolerant, and ready to ask for forgiveness for the reconciliation.
Right. Thank you very much. And so I want to also go back to Hlib, who is waiting patiently online, and actually turn to some more positive and forward-looking issues, thinking of Ukraine's EU integration. Ukraine has received EU candidate status in record time from the moment of its application. And we've also heard promises by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to integrate Ukraine as soon as possible into the EU single market. So, Hlib, can you tell us briefly what does Ukraine's EU integration in time of war deliver for the Ukrainian people and for the Ukrainian state?
Yes, even in times of war, the prospect of a single market for goods and services is very important for doing business in Ukraine, for establishing new cooperation, new business between Ukraine and EU companies. And currently we have a temporary regime of exporting Ukrainian goods to the European market, to the EU market, without duties and without quotas, which is very important for Ukraine, for Ukrainian business in times of war, that this regime will be continued, and that this decision is made as soon as possible so that businesses could plan their activities. And even like when speaking about like this transitionary period between war and post-war times, I think that we need to have like this intermediate integration of Ukraine into single markets, not waiting till the final political decision is made. And in fact, like this first temporary regime for goods is a way for in fact for de facto integration of Ukraine into single market for goods and then services. Also, it is like the current regime of temporary protection of Ukrainian refugees in the EU is like the same first step of de facto integration of Ukraine into the single labor market, and then like making a final political decision and very clear vision of the willingness of the EU countries to accept Ukraine, that like in the nearest future could be shown in opening negotiations with Ukraine on EU accession. It is also will be very important in post-war period, in early post-war period for attracting private investment to Ukraine. That is also crucial. Like when we heard this figure of 750 billion of dollars needed for Ukraine reconstruction and modernization. The half of this figure is in fact expected private investment. But also we need to get a finance to have this funding that we expect to receive from the European Union for rebuilding of Ukraine to be in fact like the part of EU accession financing. And it should be considered very clearly, like how this funding is helping Ukraine in becoming part of the European Union, to becoming competitive member of the EU. So it is also like an intellectual challenge that need to be addressed in the coming months.
Thank you, Hlib. And so there is all the benefits that integration into the market can bring, and all the other issues you've highlighted. But of course, there's also the emergency financial needs that Ukraine has right now. And we are just 2 days after the Berlin International Conference on Ukraine's reconstruction. But there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of the money that Ukraine is actually getting from its Western partners. Do you think that Ukraine's partners in the EU and in the US are delivering what they can? And what is Ukraine's appeal to them right now?
Yes, certainly the sense of urgency was not enough on the side of our partners, especially if we speak, unfortunately, about the European Union, as there was a perception that US will be like the sort of in charge of military assistance and the EU will be in charge of economic and financial assistance. Then we saw that really like that promises that were made by the EU Council as early in May, are very slow to materialize in real disbursements, and like this feeling of like looming issue for Ukraine, especially if we speak about next year, was like in the heart of this conference in Berlin on October 25th. So here, like we really speak about like the most urgent need for Ukraine winning the war. Like if we speak about financial part of it, is funding the budget deficit, that is in the area of 3 to 5 billion US dollars, dependent on the scenario, that is on its side also dependent on the issues that we discussed before, of the destruction of civilian energy infrastructure. And like while for the remaining months of 2022 the issue is more or less closed, then even first quarter of 2023 is currently in the fog for Ukrainian Ministry of Finance, with no clear expectations of disbursements. Like there are commitments from the US, commitments from the EU, but there is no clear perception that like mechanisms to get this money flowing smoothly is in place yet. But certainly, like we need also to start speaking about the fast recovery, as we see this hits on civilian infrastructure, but also unfortunately we lost a summer that could be spent on rebuilding housing in liberated areas of Ukraine and on rebuilding infrastructure, just as like President Zelensky said in Berlin, that unfortunately we haven't received a cent. Ukraine has not received a cent for recovery. Unfortunately, like there were some smaller bilateral commitments, but it was certainly not enough. And then like we also need to speak about like full recovery, because like as it was discussed by other panelists, like the situation is very fluid and if, for example, because of some reasons Ukraine wins or Russia loses fast, like there is certainly no clear vision of how this hundreds of billions that need to be channeled to Ukraine for the purposes of reconstruction, like where to find these hundreds of billions. Like will it be like legal solution related to using Russian assets? Will it be EU funding that will be in fact accession funding? It is certainly not like there is no answer.
Sure,
and
sure.
we need to find this answer fast.
Yeah. Absolutely, thank you very much. So I think with that, and because we've started a few minutes later, I would now like to open the floor to the audience. I think we started about 10 minutes later or so, so we'll have 10 or so minutes now to take questions from our guests here in the room. Please raise your hand, make yourself known, introduce yourself before you ask your question, and you can also say who you'd like to address your question to. Any immediate reactions or comments? And unfortunately, we won't be able to take questions from those who are present online. We'll have to privilege those who are in the room today. All right, there seems to be a... we have a question right there. Sorry, I didn't see you earlier.
I'm sorry, it's not a question, it's some...
If it's a comment, please just keep it brief.
My name is Vladimir Tolkach. I'm ambassador of Ukraine here in Serbia. And I would like, first of all, to explain my appreciation for participants and for organizers of this very important event for Ukraine. It's first what I would like to say. And second, I would like to turn your attention for now one little thing. We saw this process, how spread Russian aggression. It's begun not now. It's begun from monopolization of the victory of the Second World War, when Kazakhstan, Ukraine, other republic out of this victory. Only Russia won in this war, and Russia, the main anti-fascist player in the world. Second, we saw how a lot of time Russia became and tried to struggle neo-Nazi in Ukraine and other republics. And now Russia understands that neo-Nazi, it's not group, it's all Ukrainian nation. We are not neo-Nazi, but I use this determination of Russia. And after this, Russia began to struggle with all Ukrainian nation. Now it's our nation under the attack, the full attack of Russia. But it's not, I would like to turn your attention that it's not final point of Russia. Now Poland, Czech Republic, Baltic countries under the same enemy, because all of us try to struggle with Russia. We not struggle with Russia. We struggle with the regime of Russian Federation. First of all, it's very enemy regime for all of us. And I would like to turn your attention, Ukrainian war, it's not war only for Ukraine. It's war for all democratic countries, for all who would like to be the members of the European family and for democratic values. Thanks. That's what I'm sorry that I disturbed your, but that's what I would like to say. One more thank you for all of organizers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unless we have other questions, okay, we'll take one more question here.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of these panelists for this excellent presentation. My name is Edward Joseph from the U.S. Obviously, the support from the United States as the leader of NATO has been critical to the war effort in supporting this, the determination, motivation of Ukraine to fight for its freedom and sovereignty. But we have elections coming up very soon in the United States, and these midterm elections, you may have seen the comments of Kevin McCarthy, who would become the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, saying, we will not give no more open check to Ukraine. So I just quickly would like your comments. You know, the United States is not just another country in terms of its support for the effort in Ukraine, and how you anticipate that, and if the Republicans were to win, and obviously we have a specter of potentially return of a former president whose relationship with Russia is quite dubious. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we've had two very important comments and a question. I think this is all really that we have time for now. And I'd like to invite all of the speakers to actually address these in their final 1-minute comments. And I would add from my side as well, if you could in that also say a few words about how you see now the prospects for moving forward and getting to peace. Also looking at this very coercive Russian signaling that we have seen over the last months. Where do we need to get, and under what conditions you would see a just peace for Ukraine? So let's start with Hlib, who is online, and then we'll come to the speakers here.
I think that my answer also is answer to the question from the audience. I believe that like what all our partners, including American administration, current American administration and current American members of the parliament have to do, is to do as much as possible to Ukraine fast. Like in terms of the United States, it is like authorizing as much financial and military assistance right now before these by-elections to the parliament, to the Congress. And it will not only like mitigate the risks mentioned, but also it will in fact like Ukraine winning the war faster will in fact result in less expenditures, less money spent by the taxpayers of our partners for helping Ukraine in winning the war. Thank you.
Thank you, Hlib. Mykhailo, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that talking about the position of the United States and next American administration, it's very easy to answer. Let's model situation if Russia wins. And what we see after this, China will join Russia, join another Iranian, let's say, authoritarianism with maybe nuclear weapon very soon, because Russia, I am sure Russia now is transferring nuclear weapon to Iran, and I'm sure that United States and other NATO countries should pay attention on this, if they understand it. But if we model it, and if we model this situation, I hope that it's not only political talking about it. If United States administration, next administration, Republicans, Democratic, it's doesn't matter. They model the situation of transferring the world after Russia wins. They will support Ukraine. We don't need open checks. We don't need money. We just need more weapon. And if we're talking about how the American land-lease work, it's not the money for Ukraine. It's only a leasing of weapons, which we will back you after victory. So the answer is very simple. United States, next administration of United States will support Ukraine because it's our interest of United States. Do not allow authoritarian countries, dictatorship countries, to be the strongest power and strongest force in next future. I am not sure that all of us want to live in such a world.
Yeah, Thank you very much. Liliana, final words?
Yeah, I would like to end up on that and to say that Ukraine government have presented its recovery plan, recovery and reconstruction plan just after 4 months after the full-scale invasion of Russia, and this plan actually, maybe someone do not know about that, or maybe do not imagine how the plan was actually discussed, but it was joint. It was joint actions of Ukrainian government and of civil society organizations, because it was also possible, even in April, May, when the huge battles were going on that times, even on the time when the Mariupol defenders were still there in the Mariupol fighting, civil society organizations were able to propose some solutions for the reforms, and we were able to do it in more than 20 thematic divisions, and I think it's great that now we see that both society.
In American context, in the American domestic context, it's completely different from Ukrainian question in Russian domestic conflict. So the Ukrainian question in America, and Ukraine has always benefited from it, was always something uniting two parties. And I am pretty sure that here, based on national interests of US, Ukraine, European Union general interest, we will not lose this kind of support, even in the case that Republicans will run the Congress. And what's next? That's a very important question. So next month, I'm pretty sure we will hear louder signals from Russia through different channels about their so-called readiness for negotiations. Let's not be fooled with these messages. Russia needs some kind of a pause. Their almost 200,000 army has gone, wounded, killed, whatever. That's why they are conducted now not partial but full mobilization in Russia, and they conducted forceful mobilization of Ukrainian people in occupied territories in violation of all international humanitarian law, which is prohibited according to 4th Geneva Convention, to conscript, to enforce people to participate in the army, police, whatever. People in occupied areas are fully locked. Since middle of the summer, men aged 18-35 are not allowed to leave these territories. So the only way to escape was to leave occupied areas via Crimea, then to Russia, and then through Latvia or Estonia to the European Union or to Georgia. So Russia is doing now, they are trying to make a fake picture of their readiness for negotiations. They need a pause, they need to mobilize people, they need to find some other arms like they are doing right now from Iran, and they make their very important short-term strategy is to decrease, to slow down the military support to Ukraine, because as soon as there is any kind of a hope for negotiations, let's say, or someone believes in that hope, the military support will automatically, according to Western diplomacy logic, will be decreased, because this is the logic of the West. If you are negotiating, you are not fighting. In terms of Russia, if you are negotiating, you are fighting more. And what we have seen in Donbass since 2014, every time Russia set down Minsk I, Minsk II, they happened in the light of incredible severe attacks on Debaltseve, on Ilovaisk, on Ukrainian Donetsk airport. So that is the normal logic of Russia. So not be fooled. The sooner Ukraine will defend its air by air defense system, additional ones, anti-missile system, the sooner we will be able to conduct land operations on the ground and liberate Ukrainian territories.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariia. And this is a really important, stark message and warning, actually, to take away from this discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their excellent insights into this.